Hi everyone, sorry we're a few minutes late getting started with this. My name is Luke Weston, I'm one of the members of the Early Career Committee, the Atmospheric Science section. So I'll be convening this session today, and generally how it works, we have 4 great panelists who have volunteered to talk about the topic today, which is best practices in reviewing scientific papers. I'll let them give themselves a proper introduction in a second. How it'll work, we have some questions that have been asked ahead of time that we'll generally work through after these brief introductions. But we'll be taking audience questions as well. So if you want to ask questions, please ask them using the questions function on the GoTo. So you should have a little box and there'll be a questions function there, or also you can use the chat function as well to ask questions, and we'll come to those throughout the session, and we'll address them in turn. So if we don't address them straight away, we will get around to them, but we might just come on to them a little bit later. So thanks very much for attending. I think this will be a really great seminar, and I think I'll go ahead and get started and allow the panelists to introduce themselves. So if we start with Alison Steiner, if you would like to begin.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks to the Early Career Committee and the organizers for putting this together and asking me to talk today. So I'm a professor in atmospheric sciences at the University of Michigan in the Climate and Space Sciences and Engineering Department. And in the past, I've been an editor at JGR Atmospheres. I was an editor there for 5 years. And I'm also currently the president-elect for the atmospheric science section for AGU. And my research focuses on land-atmosphere interactions and how they influence both atmospheric chemistry and regional climate.
Thank you very much. And if we move on to Ian Faluna, if you're able to go next, please.
Hi, yes. Welcome and thank you for having me. My name is Ian Faluna. I am an atmospheric scientist. I work at University of California, Davis. And I do work on air pollution and atmospheric chemistry and dynamics. So I try to mix boundary layer and mesoscale dynamics and their interplay with chemistry. I am now, associate editor at Elementa. And I have, I won the GRL award for reviewing, which I was very, very proud of last year. So that's my story.
Thanks, Ian. And then Dan Chavez, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Sure, yeah, I'm Dan Chavez. I'm an associate professor of atmospheric science at Purdue University. I've been here for about 6 years. I generally work on climate and extreme weather, particularly hurricanes and severe thunderstorms, and how they're modulated by climate. I guess I got one GRL reviewer award by Susanna here, which is awesome. So that's my background.
Thanks very much. And finally, Susanna, if you can go ahead. I think you're muted. Susanna, we can't hear you.
Hello, I'm Susanna Camargo. I'm a Lamont Research Professor. I work mainly with hurricanes and climate, and I have been a GRL editor since 2018, and I'm also a Journal of Climate Associate Editor since 2016. And I think I started this also because I was reviewing a lot of papers and also getting some of the reviewer awards, and then I ended up becoming an editor. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. That's really great, getting a bit background on you all. So the questions that we're going to go through are generally aimed at, I guess, people looking to review papers and starting out reviewing and trying to improve early stages of reviewing papers and wanting to improve how they do. So some of the motivation behind this was really that there's no, or often no, formal training when it comes to reviewing papers. It's something which is passed down, say, from supervisor or from peers, or sometimes you're just left sort of to jump in the deep end and do this. I really wanted to go through and here's some best reviewing practices, and I guess some more formal training of how you can make your reviews most useful, and hopefully that can also assist in the way that you're putting together scientific papers. So one of the most common questions that we were asked, or asked to pose to you guys, was how do you get started with reviewing articles? If you're in the early stage of your career and you would like to review articles, what's the best way to go about doing that? And I guess if we start with Alison, perhaps we can.
Yeah. So usually what happens is after you start publishing papers, your name will start popping up on, like, you know, if an editor is looking for something on a specific topic, your name comes up as having recently written a paper, then you're going to start getting requests. But you don't have to wait for something like that to happen. So what I often suggest is to, so for example, like for most of you, or, you know, I think most people here are in atmospheric sciences, so you can contact editors and let them know that you're interested in reviewing papers. I used to love to get this as an editor because it's really, really hard to find reviewers. And with, so for example, like with AGU publications, you can fill out a profile online and put in topic keywords. That way then editors can search on those topics. But don't feel, you know, I would suggest reaching out to editors. So for example, if you go to like JGR Atmospheres, you can see what topics different editors handle. And you can write them and say, hey, I'm a graduate student, I'm interested in reviewing, or hey, I'm a postdoc and I'd like to review some papers. These are some of the things I'm interested in. And my guess is you'll get asked to review pretty quickly.
Does anybody else have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just jump in and say that you also might want to just talk to any of your colleagues, a mentor or anything, an advisor of any sort, because they are bound to be asked to review about once a week. And whenever that happens, they have to put in a, you know, well, they don't have to, but they're requested to put in alternate review names. And so you can easily get kind of in the queue that way as well. If you just let it be known that you're interested in it, I think, as Alison said, you'll be called upon soon.
I just want to add that in some cases, the advisors actually invite the students to review the papers with them. And I think it's a great way to learn how to review your first papers if you're doing it together with your advisor. And the only thing then the advisor and whoever is the official reviewer has to disclose that to the editor. And usually there's a place for you to do that, I shared this paper with this person. And sometimes the reviewers even ask, is it okay if I ask my student to review this paper with me? So I think in the case of students, that's a very good way to start.
I have nothing to add, so it's all great.
Yeah, just as a follow-up to Susanna's point, I mean, that is something that I typically do with my graduate students here at Michigan, is that like once they get to their second or third year, I'll say like, okay, now it's time to start practicing reviewing papers. And so when I get things come across my desk, I'll often do exactly that. Like I'll accept it and say, I'm going to work with a graduate student on this. And then we sort of walk through the process. You know, I sort of take them through like how I approach reviews and we do it together. And then I usually, after doing it together once, they feel a lot more confident to go on and do it on their own. Not that you need to have your advisor there, but sometimes it's helpful. Like if the process is kind of opaque to you, then sometimes it can be helpful to get through some of those details and also like, you know, start to learn good practices about how to be a good reviewer.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. That's a great start. I think a lot of good advice for getting started. The next question that we were asked, it's quite common, was once you start getting asked to review, how often should you be accepting these reviews? Should you be, you know, accepting everything that comes your way, or should you be more selective about the papers you review?
My suggestion is that you're very selective, that you choose accept the reviews that you really want to read that paper. If that paper is published and it, comes out in a journal, you think, oh, I think I would like to read that, and it's related to my research. I think, especially when you're beginning to review, it's better to be more selective and choose things that really are of interest to you, are very related to your PhD or your postdoc, and then you can branch out.
Do you have any other comments from? Sorry, Dan.
Oh, yeah, I guess I'd just say, yeah, I mean, in terms of an actual like frequency, to me, usually like one per month is already a pretty solid amount of time commitment, I think. So, but yeah, it also depends on the topic. I think both if it's interesting to you, what Susanna was saying, but then also, do you think, to me, the lens is always like, is this a paper that I think my expertise could help improve or critically evaluate? And so, does it align well with your interests and your background, where you feel like, again, your job's going to be to try to help someone, ideally to help someone make their paper better. So, but if to put a number on it, I guess I would say like one a month seems like a lot, but I don't know if the editors would agree. So
I agree. That sounds like a lot, especially for someone starting. For someone starting, one a month is a lot, in my opinion.
Let's put it at the cap at one a month.
Right.
Ideally, should not do more than that, or you're probably doing too much.
Because the amount of time it takes you when you're first starting is much longer. I remember talking when I was a postdoc, talking at the lunch table at NCAR, and I mentioned to someone that I'd been spending, I spent the last 4 days reviewing this paper, and all their jaws dropped. Like, oh my God, you spend that much time. So I realized it takes some time, just like it takes time to be really fluent with reading papers and assimilating the information. Reviewing it is like exponentially harder and more time consuming, in my opinion. So I would pump the brakes when you start, at least.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We used to say if you publish one paper a year, you should be reviewing more or less 2, 3 a year. So I think for a start, that's a good
way.
I like that.
Yeah, and I think that's a rule of thumb. I think people say a lot because, like, every time you submit a paper, an editor is trying to get 2 to 3 people to review it. So essentially, like, your quota on the number of reviews you do, sometimes people scale it to how many papers you're submitting, and that I think comes from this idea of like giving back to the community. So sometimes I sort of joke that like reviewing papers is kind of like doing your taxes. Like everyone should be doing it, and some people do a lot, like put a lot more effort into it than other people. So it is kind of a community service. So you want to think about that. And just to echo the comments about like, like how long it takes and what you should like in terms of like what types of papers you should accept. If it's something close to your subject area, it's going to be a much easier job, and you'll have a lot more creative suggestions and approaches for the paper writers than if it's something outside of your area. Like if you feel like if you read the abstract and like, oh, I need to read 10 papers just to understand what they're talking about, that's probably like a good guy, maybe not 10, or even if you have to read 5 papers, like to just kind of get up to speed on what they're talking about, then maybe that's something that's a little bit outside your expertise. And as you're starting out and building your sort of reviewing portfolio, then you can start taking more risks a little bit later on.
If I could just add to that, because this has come up a couple times, is if for some reason you launch into a review and it becomes clear, like it wasn't clear in the abstract, but it becomes clear that you have big holes in your knowledge in certain aspects of the paper, do not be afraid to explicitly describe that in your review to the editors. So it's not a worthless review if you're only reviewing sort of 1 or 2 technical aspects of the paper. It's still quite valuable, but it's best to just be upfront about that, and instead of worrying about it or spending a week kind of coming up to speed on something. Just FYI, because that's been.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. Thanks. So the next question is it's sort of related, I guess. We've asked what sort of papers, or we've answered what sort of papers we should be reviewing. And the next question was really around what sort of journal should we be reviewing for? So how is it best to identify predatory journals who may be asking you to review papers, and whether you should be reviewing for them?
At this point, I only review papers for scientific societies like AGU, AMS, EGU. I tend to avoid other types of journals. Once in a while, Nature and Science, sometimes I do, but now they have like 1 billion different versions of them. It's like a colleague, joke. There is Nature Delaware now, or or something like that. Hope nobody's from Delaware. And I will be frank here. MDPI journals, I completely avoid. I have them go, the requests go directly to my spam box, and I do not even reply.
Do you have any other perspectives on this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of practical for someone who's, if you're not sure, I mean, have you read any papers from that journal that you respect? Or if you need to do a little Googling and looking at what papers have come out in your field from that journal, that's probably a quick way. I don't really know specifically what's predatory versus not predatory, but yeah, just like, do they publish stuff that you think is interesting or relevant? At least that's maybe a starting point. Doesn't mean that the journal is great, but you certainly, if you look and they don't publish anything of interest, then you probably don't need to review it.
Look at some papers of that journal and see the quality of the papers and see if you think, the standard's good as well.
This is also a good thing to ask your advisor about, the people, or even other people in your research group, like other grad students and postdocs. I think, I know the Earth Science Women's Network just did a special webinar all on predatory journals, which actually I really wanted to attend. It looked like it was really interesting because I think this is kind of like a growing concern. So I think, Susanna's comments about like professional society journals, the sort of like science nature family, as the growing science nature family. I mean, like all those are ones, think about where you'd like to publish. And if something comes through your inbox and you're not sure, it's a good idea to ask around and get people's opinions because it does take up a lot of your time. That said, those like your comments could be really helpful for a wide range of journals. So, I think I'd sort of ask around and see what's a good use of your time.
Thanks very much. We'll address some of the questions from the chat. Maybe is good right now. I think it's a good stage to do it. So we were talking about what papers you might choose to review, but then I guess the next question seems coming is, okay, when we go to review an article, well, what's the process we should be going through, and roughly how long should we be spending on these different aspects, and how does that compare to the time allocation an editorial board might allocate you? So I guess first question really is what would you say the process that you should go through when you're reviewing a paper, and how long would you spend perhaps doing that?
That's a hard question because the length of time varies a lot. So, in terms of how much time you have to get a review back, something like GRL is shorter, they give you 14 days. Something like JGR Atmospheres is longer, you might have 3 weeks or 4 weeks. You can always ask for extension. Sometimes if I have deadlines coming up and I really want to review a paper, I'll ask the editor for more time. And these days you're usually likely to get it because we're really desperate for reviewers in general right now. So it kind of depends, like it depends on the turnaround time, and different journals have different turnaround times. How much time you spend on each one can be a very slippery slope because it's really easy, like Ian was saying earlier, like, you could spend 4 days reviewing a paper, you could spend 5 days, so it kind of takes a little bit of time to figure out how much time you should be putting into it. Also, as I mentioned, like sometimes I'll read a paper and I'll think, oh, to understand this, I really need to read this other paper. And then you can easily go down the rabbit hole reading lots of papers. And in general, I generally try to time box, how much time I spend on an article, but over my career, that's changed substantially. So like when I was an editor at JGR, I was handling like 200 papers a year. So was I actually reading all of those papers? Obviously, I was not reading in full 200 papers a year, but I got much better at reading quickly for content, and figuring out what the issues and the pros and cons of different things were in terms of making a decision. So I really hesitate to put a number on it because it takes some time to build that skill. And so in the beginning, it's going to take you more time, and then over time, it gets easier.
One thing I'd like to add to that is that one really specific point I would like to make is try not to do it in one block of time. I find that you really should read it first and then let it simmer in the back of your head for a few days if you can. So instead of like waiting to the end of the deadline and you have to do it tomorrow and you just do it all in one block of time, which is, a common practice for some of us, I believe it really merits that you need to think about the topics in it for a little bit longer than that. Like, you know, so because sometimes it takes a while for these ideas to sort of take or hold or set, and so I would definitely try to do it on different days if you can, spread it out over different days. And I would say a time personally, I mean, I think 20 to 30 hours is not well. I think 20 to 30 hours is not a bad amount of time, personally. I'd like to know what the rest of the panel thinks.
Twenty, 30 hours in one paper, that's a lot of time in one paper. Yeah, I have done that, but I haven't done that for every single paper. So.
I usually aim for a day, so 8 hours as like unless it's warrants a lot more time because it's very technical or something. But it needs to be really a dedicated 8 hours. But really, and actually building on what you said, Ian, was like I think it helps even. I like to not only do the first read through, but jot down kind of the big things that jump out to me. And it actually then doing it in multiple stages is really critical because I find it helps me to criticize my own initial criticisms and make sure sometimes I'll have things that I say, oh, this is terrible, and I write it down, and then I come back a few days later and I read it. I'm like, oh, maybe I'm a little bit like overzealous here. And so I think that's also helpful, is not just to kind of understand what the paper's saying, but give yourself a chance to even kind of, sometimes you may have some emotions that come in, maybe you know the authors, maybe whatever it is, that gives you a chance to be self-critical of your own evaluation. So yeah, otherwise I go for 8 hours, but sometimes definitely things need more time than that. So.
Okay, we have another question which is related to this. I mean, you said that depending on what you know, different papers take different lengths of time. But we have a question about, well, what pre-screening is done at the editorial stage to ensure that a paper is fit to being at the point of review, and essentially how much, as a reviewer, how much should you be contributing to that paper? Should you be contributing scientific knowledge, purely evaluating the science which is there? Or even in terms of things like language editing, how much are you expected? So what is your expectation of a role in reviewer? And at what point do you have grounds to reject that paper if you don't think it's ready to be in the review stage? Or is that an editorial decision to make?
Yes, I think that's the first thing. Reviewers don't make decisions, and a lot of reviewers get confused by that. Reviewers, they can make recommendations and suggestions to the editor, but who decides if the paper is accepted, rejected, or go for revision? That role is from the editor. So as an editor, my main input that I want from a reviewer is about the science. If the science is solid, if it's a novel, if it's something that important, and the methods are solid, if there are things that should be added. Language, I think it's important and it's helpful, but I don't think that's mine. I don't think that's, as an editor, that's the main thing I want the reviewers spend their time doing. As much as they want to do is absolutely helpful and good, but I would rather have much more information on the science than on the language. And reviewers have to be very careful also how they talk about the language, especially with the foreign authors and authors with different names. People make assumptions. So that's something that as an editor, it's hard. Sometimes reviewers make some comments that are not very sensitive to the authors. So that's, the language can be tricky too, depending on what the reviewer is saying about the language.
Do we have any more comments on the role of the reviewer, and especially if you feel that papers aren't up to standard, aren't to the point of being
Yeah, I was going to say just a little bit about like just to answer that pre-screen question, like are things pre-screened? And so yes, that is part of the editor's role. So like I can speak to the process at like JGR Atmospheres, for example. So, papers come in and there's an editor-in-chief who sits at the top who funnels different topics to different editors, right? So then as an editor, I would get the paper and I would do a pre-screen on it. And sometimes you can get things rejected for being like out of scope, for example. So like one example by out of scope is that in JGR Atmospheres, I was doing a lot of like land surface fluxes, but there's also JGR Biogeosciences. So if it was much more focused on like carbon fluxes or nitrogen fluxes, a lot of times I would say like, okay, JGR Atmospheres is really about atmosphere, right? You get in this kind of fuzzy area about like what is atmosphere versus flux, and you can think about that. But a lot of the carbon and nitrogen flux papers were really more being published over at JGR Biogeosciences, and so then we would sometimes transfer it and say, okay, this is a little out of scope for atmospheres, but we're going to suggest another AGU journal. So sometimes it'll be a scope decision, so sometimes things get rejected for scope, or sometimes things get rejected because there's not enough new science in the paper, and sometimes you can kind of see that early on. And so that is on the editors to do a bit of pre-screening. And the idea is that if you're going to take reviewers' time, you think that the paper has some merit that would make it worthy for publication in the journal before you send it out for review and use up reviewers' time to do that. So there usually is some kind of pre-screen. I'm speaking sort of for like AGU journals, and I'm sure that AMS probably does something similar. I think this is where you get into some of the predatory journals, which they might just be sending out everything, so you don't really know exactly what you're getting. In terms of like this question about what qualifies for rejection and things like that, Susanna's comments were great about like that's really up to the editor. But I think one thing that's kind of important to think about is providing constructive feedback to the writers of the paper so they could actually turn the paper around to do something useful. So if I think like if I'm reviewing something and I think like there's nothing new here, or I don't agree with how simulations are done, or there's something I disagree with, I would usually make a recommendation like, okay, what could they do to make this paper better and make it publishable? So I try to be pretty concrete in those suggestions such that then the editor can take that and say like, okay, well, if they did X, Y, and Z, then it would be publishable, or there's no way that this would be publishable. So those kinds of comments can be really helpful for the editor if you can be specific about what would actually make it better, or if there's nothing that you really see that would make the paper a new contribution to science.
Yeah, I would like to stress that we really want to give a positive feedback to the author. Even if the end you're saying that you don't think that the paper is going to be published, you say, how could you improve it? Sometimes reviewers are a little, they think they have a better idea of how to write the paper. And that's not what they're supposed to do. They are not supposed to come up with a new paper and tell the authors to write a completely new paper. What they're supposed to do is look at what the authors have done and how they can improve that paper. Even if you have a brilliant idea to do that, that's not what being asked to do. You can have a lot of suggestions, but you also have to keep in mind, if you're asking the authors to do 20 new simulations that would take the authors like 2 years to do, that's not helpful either. So you can make suggestions, but you have to think, if I were doing that, how long would it take me to do? What would be the time and effort that I would have to put to do that? So your suggestions have to be reasonable too. We would all like perfect papers and do all the simulations in the world, but things have to be contained and within what the author's ideas are, I think.
Yeah, I guess I'd just say I try to, as the only pure reviewer here. I mean, even though you don't sign your reviews probably most of the time, pretend like you're talking to a colleague and you want to be helpful, be nice and be specific and be helpful. But I think if you or imagine trying to be the person on the other end, what kind of review would you like to get? So just know that you're talking to another human being who's trying to, you guys should start by assuming they're trying to do the best of their science. So.
Yeah, I often say, like, review the paper you get, not the one you want to get. Like, to Susanna's comment, like, it's really easy to say, well, you asked this question wrong, or these simulations are completely wrong, or, you should have done the observations this way. Like, that isn't particularly constructive, because they can't go back and redo all of it per se. So when I say constructive, like within reason, I think that's an important thing to note. And like Dan said, think about how you would feel if you got those comments back, and try to keep that lens when you're making your comments. That's where Ian's comment about the take a day and give it like go back and revisit it is a really good comment too, because turn the sort of angry stuff into nicer, more pleasant things.
Yeah, I mean, I have pretty strong opinions about this, so I'm not sure that this is universal or I'm correct, but I do feel that this is, aside from the science that you do yourself, this is the most important thing you're doing in your career, in my opinion. Then that is making the whole community science better. And so I often go in with the idea, with the feeling implicitly that I am a co-author. I'm not going to get credit. I might not even get any acknowledgments, but I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to go about it, is thinking like, if you do have good ideas and good contributions, that by all means share them, and without being too dogmatic, as the panelists are saying, but that this is part of science. Science is a community thing. It's more like playing a symphony than doing this jazz solo. So I think that this is a really important aspect, and that you should share your ideas freely with reviewers. I've actually made scientific colleagues through reviews that eventually came out that I reviewed, and then we wrote proposals together because we were collectively thinking about something. So I do think of it as a social endeavor, and a really important one.
Yeah, thanks, man. We had another question, which I think we can sort of link actually to what you just spoken about, Ian. So, like you said, that this is a community process, and things that we think of collectively. One of the questions we had prior to this was, well, what's then defined as a conflict of interest when reviewing a journal? What does that mean if you're declaring a conflict of interest? I'm not sure if you could take that, Ian, or somebody else might want to jump in.
Well, they're the easy ones. You shouldn't be reviewing papers of your colleagues from your division, or your collaborators, your students and postdocs. So these are all clear conflict of interest. But let's say I collaborate with someone today. In 5 years, this person writes a paper. Then, then it depends on how you feel about, if you can judge that, without thinking about the person being your friend and things like that. But there are this. Are you going to get anything? Do your judgment different because you know that person, you're close to that person, or you have a relationship with a person. And I would point something out is sometimes, you are doing some science that's very close to that person and would be actually a competition to, I don't know, write a similar paper or a proposal on that topic. And if it's that close, I also would think it's better to avoid, because you might, without really meaning to, try to slow down the person's progress. So I think that's another type of conflict that we don't talk as much as just, asking your best buddy to review your paper, which some, people, when they recommend reviewers, they should not be recommending their beer buddies. Yeah.
We don't have any more responses to that. I think we can move on.
Can I ask you, since we have the editors here, is it all right? Because I've never been curious. Would you recommend people, if they're not sure, to reach out to you and ask, hey, I'm not sure if this is, would you consider this a conflict of interest? Or
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I would. If you're not sure, you can always ask the editor. and see what they think. And they might, you can kind of explain the situation, and then they'll kind of help you make that decision if it feels. My general feeling is if it feels sticky, like if you feel kind of unsure about it, then it's probably just best to say no and say a conflict of interest. But you can always ask and see. I think, different different agencies or different journals, like sometimes there's like 48 months is a pretty common like timeline that we often get, like of listing conflicts of interest. So anybody, again, well, for a lot of you who are early career, that wouldn't make that much of a difference because it's before you really started and working on the field. But like that's one line that people often use. But sometimes even if I don't have a formal collaboration with someone, I still kind of feel uncomfortable. If it's somebody that I happen to be pretty close to in the community, then I would tend to decline reviewing it, even if it's not a formal conflict of interest.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. I think that answers the question quite well. We have a couple of questions on some of the more technical aspects of reviewing. So if I understood the question correctly, maybe we can able to join two of these together actually. But one is, should we really be going line by line and making comments? Or what's the balance of the comments we should be making? Is it better to have broad general comments on improving the paper, or do we want some more technical, almost line by line style comments throughout the paper? And there was another question which I think we can maybe relate to this here is things like references. If we go through, I mean, should we be checking that every single citation and reference that is made is the best reference for that case? Does it include that information, or is there a certain level of trust there over your page? So I guess two questions. One, how technical or how detailed should these reviews be, and how much should we be looking into the real nuts and bolts, or how much should be based on trust? If anyone has an answer to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think as a reviewer, you were not allowed to trust. You're being as skeptical as you possibly can, but you can't track down every review and read the whole thing and make sure that there's a reference. But if it's a critical point they're making and they're off-sourcing it to a different paper, it's important to look at that paper and make sure that the ideas are there, because I mean, I often find that references are just wrong and mistakes are made. So I think you should I think your job is to be skeptical and to question most everything within a certain, within a reasonable amount of time. In terms of the specific comments, I mean, normally you write specific comments as you go through it, and then those go into forming a larger impression and ideas as it percolates more through you, what's possibly missing or what's cloudy and unclear. And then, so you usually write that in the front, describe what the paper is so that you can kind of like repeat what their intention is, so that they can verify that you got the idea. And then some general impressions, and then always I put line by line stuff, absolutely. And some of the times those will branch out into bigger discussions, but a lot of times they're just like simple, this sentence meant this, means this, doesn't mean that kind of thing. So I think a mixture of both is important, specific and general.
Yeah, I like that when reviewers put, their general impression of papers and then like some technical points that they want to discuss. And then of course they can go for a list of all the typos that they find or stuff like that. But if they put that in separate categories within their review, makes clear that, having a typo is not the same thing of having the, correct interpretation of something. So I think it's very helpful for the editors if the reviewers try to be very strategic of what kind of comment is that, not liking the color scheme. It's very different from having a different scientific interpretation.
Yeah, I'll second that. I find it kind of helpful to have the comments grouped as like, big major issues, minor issues like this reference isn't seen quite right, and like editorials and typos. But I guess I kind of and I think Susanna said this in the very beginning, just, you're being asked for your scientific expertise. So you know, a lot of times when reviewing, like I'll kind of hit the main typos, or like if a sentence stops mid-sentence, or if something doesn't make sense, I'll kind of hit the big issues, like in terms of general understanding of the paper. But I would say to kind of focus more of your efforts on the evaluating the science and the methodology, because that's really what you're being asked to do. There was one other thing I lost. There was one other thing I was going to say. I forgot. So if I think of it, I'll come back to it.
Okay.
Oh, I remember. It was the reference thing. Sorry, I was like, I knew there was something else I wanted to say. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's easy to see how like one misreference tends to carry from paper to paper, meaning like people can misinterpret what a paper says, and then like people will kind of carry that reference forward. So I would say like, but going through all the references is incredibly time consuming. You know, you also want to be careful. Sometimes I would see this a lot as an editor where, you know, people would say you should be citing all my papers and list them all. It's not always, and then interestingly, as an editor, you would always think like if you get a paper and they say you should cite, you know, Faluna 2001 and 2002 and 2003, you must be like, oh, of course that's Ian's paper. It's Ian being the reviewer. But sometimes it's not actually. Like sometimes there's some other advocate that they're pushing, you know, for some other chunk of work they think is missing. So it's not always that. But you do want to be careful about thinking like, you know, highlighting which references you think are really key if they missed it. That happens all the time. And that's what you're there to help with. But you don't have to dig down every reference. I mean, sometimes when I'm reviewing papers, I'll see like, oh, they cited these two papers and I haven't seen those before. So I might look them up because of my genuine interest in the topic. But you don't have to really like police every reference. So like your job is really focusing on the science evaluation, the methods, and the, you know, that sort of core part of the paper.
Okay, great, thanks very much. So Alison, you really touched on your role is really looking at the methodology and the scientific evaluating the science with it. So a question for all of you really, when you go about reviewing a paper, how do you approach that paper? I mean, I think Ian, you touched on, you know, read through, let it simmer and go back, but when you're looking, are you reading from start to finish? Did you start on the methods? How would you approach that paper when reviewing it?
I mean, I approach it just like I would be reading any paper, right? You normally read the abstract, you look at the figures, and then you launch in. I mean, I think one of the things you're trying to review is how it's going to appear to people who, you know, normally read the literature, which is, so you do it the way you would read a normal paper, that you were going to read thoroughly.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I use the similar, but Ian mentioned this, like, and Dan also, like, you take the paper, you read it, you put it down for a couple days, then you come back and you start digging into the details. You start writing the review, you put it down, and then you go back and make sure you don't, you know, make it sound nice and polite and things like that. I mean, that's kind of a general story. So it helps to kind of get a good overview first about where they're going and what they're doing. Again, like, so you're reviewing the paper that they actually wrote, not the one that you think that they should write. And that can kind of help you sort of step through the process. And I would, you know, I'd say like as you're starting to learn how to do this, talk to other people in your research group, hopefully not about the specific paper, but you can talk with other people about what their process is like, and, you know, get a sense for how other people do it too. But I think that sort of like read it, take it all in, step back, go back to it, like that kind of iterative approach, if you have the time to do that, is really helpful.
I followed the same process, is that I copy paste. I have like from a previous review, pop up a document, start jotting down. I usually just have like, in that first read through, I just have a bullet point of things that pop up in my brain that I'm worried about or unsure about or skeptical of, but always with the hope that as I read, when I go back in depth, or if I have a little bit of time to think about it, I'll understand it better. Yeah, and then sometimes do 3 stages, kind of read it first with an open sheet of paper to write something down, then do kind of one round of major stuff. I always kind of start with the major stuff. It's like, ideally you review a paper, and when you've read through once, nothing major pops out. You say, that's pretty cool. And then you can kind of then say, all right, well, I'll come back to this and go through more carefully some of the minor things. Or even I'd say also, sometimes I'll put things down and I'll just have like a general category. I'm like, I'm not sure if this is a major issue or not. And it'll take some time to figure out whether it's like, okay, this is something I'm worried about, but it's not central to the paper. I don't think it's that big of a deal, so it's probably then a minor. So like things, I can move things around on my piece of paper or on my Word document in front of me, and then over time figure out what things are really major and what are minor. And so, yeah, they usually, for me, my process, I'd say is usually three stages.
Another thing that I think we don't do enough in our reviews is actually say how the positive things in the paper. Say, oh, this is such an interesting idea. This is such a good approach. I really like that. And, you know, since the reviewers tend to be always negative and very few are positive. And I really like when I get the review and the reviewer is, you know, praising the good things of the paper. I think we should do both, you know, be critical of the problems of issues, but also if they're good things, why not put in your, you know, review and say that.
Yeah.
Especially for early career scientists. When the first time they get a review, it's so, you know, hard if they're only negative points about your paper. So think about, again, the person who's be reviewing that. So they're good things, you should say them.
There's a question I guess we can sort of relate to that as well, is should we be signing our names to reviews, or why might somebody choose to sign their name to the review or not?
I mean, I have a pretty strong opinion about this. When I was a grad student, I read an article in EOS or something about how we should all be signing our names to everything, complete transparency. And I was an idealistic graduate student. I kind of took that up, and I think for the first, I don't know, 3 or 4 years of my reviewing, I did that. And I don't think it helped me out. I really suspect that I made some, you know, enemies or frenemies maybe. But so I would suggest not doing it at first. That's all. I mean, I think I like the idea of transparency, but I would not do it as you start out. And you know, maybe as you get more established and more comfortable, and you learn how to write, you know, gentler, kinder, more inclusive reviews, then maybe start to do that. But I would not do it right out of the gate. That's my own experience.
I would agree with that. I have some people that review for me that disclose their names, but most of them are already at the senior level and they always write, you know, sign all their reviews. If you're just starting and you still need, you know, the recognition, and you're going to need the, you know, letters for getting a job or being promoted and stuff, like, can be tricky. It depends on what you write and who you're reviewing, and especially if you don't know those people. So I'd recommend for early careers, do not start doing that until you're a little more established.
Yeah, I'll put a third on that comment. I've actually seen backlash against people who've signed reviews when they were early career. And I think that is especially harder for women and underrepresented groups. You're going to be subject to a lot more scrutiny and negative comments, and people will. I've seen it used against people, and so I would not recommend. I mean, I would not recommend doing it earlier. As Ian said, maybe a little bit later, but not early career.
Yeah, in my case, I've signed a decent number of reviews, and I certainly only sign if, I mean, I think you want to think if, do you want them, you're letting them know who you are. Is it something where it's like the reviews, the things you've written down, would you walk up to them and hand them your review? And then even then you still might not want to sign it. But if you do, I mean, you're thinking about, yeah, do you want them to know, like, if you feel like, for me, it's often for papers that I think are really awesome. Going back to Susanna's point, like I love to say if I'm like, this is so cool. And so, but then if I feel like I'm actually adding something to the paper that can make a paper better, and I want, you know, I'm happy for them to know that. I think it can be really great, but it's always in a very positive context. But I will add that, Ian, you had said before about you've made colleagues and collaborators, and I absolutely have. I have multiple collaborators, including one of my current postdocs, who like I basically met through signing a review. So I do think, though, yeah, it helps. I think it also is in the context of things where I've perceived myself to be an expert, so I don't think I was too worried that like by signing this, people are gonna be like, who the heck is this guy to talk about this stuff? So that was probably like a fairly narrow topic area, but so I think you should be careful about it, but I think it can be really great. I would definitely only do it in a review that's pretty positive to begin with, I would say.
Thanks so much. I just want to pull up on a point that Alison made actually, and relating to a question we had that was put to us before this started, and that's about implicit biases when reviewing. And it's a question of how do we, or how as a reviewer do you avoid implicit biases when reviewing papers?
I'll just quick make comments. It's what we said before. My response to this, at least, was that doing the staging, I think helps a lot. I think you want to get emotions and thoughts out of it, and trying to be as objective as you can and self-critical, I think helps. That's kind of the term implicit bias writ large, just like your goal is to be as objective about the science as possible. And so having multiple stages, I think for whatever reason you have feelings that are not about the science that enter in when you sit down the first time to look at a paper, I think you really want to minimize those. And so that's where the staging can help. So that's just my thought. I'd love to hear others.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. One thing I would recommend, if you are curious about this, is you can take these implicit bias tests online. And the way, you kind of get a sense of how they operate and how they measure this type of thing, because it is actually a quantitative thing that's been established by social scientists. So you can take that just to test your own, just to see if there is any, what might be considered implicit bias, because of course it being implicit is very hard to root out. Right? It's so you might want to just try that just to get a sense of where you might have weak points.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because it's hard, like in terms of like trying to do like a double blind process, it's really complicated because when people are working on specific science topics, a lot of the fields we work in are pretty narrow. So, if people have certain instruments, you can usually guess what group they're coming from, or if they're using certain models, it's the same way. So it's hard to imagine a space where like a truly double blind process would work. Although, like, for example, with some NASA proposals, they're starting to do this double blind process, and you have to prepare your proposal in a certain way, right? That's actually more complicated than publications, right? Because you can't leave out certain details in publications. And so it's hard to imagine how that would work. And so I get like, I would also say the dance process, this sort of multi-stage, if you're being thoughtful and reflective about it, can help to try to eliminate some of that. And unfortunately, I think it's something we still are going to carry with us, and it's going to be hard to really root out of peer review. That's where the editors can kind of come in and help and look for comments where they're really, sometimes you would see certain research group factions about how things are done that are bringing this bias in there. And hopefully that's where, as editors get more reviews from people, they can start to potentially see some of that and use that to inform a final decision on a paper.
Thanks very much. Unless anybody else has anything to add there. I think we're probably going to be down to the last question now. I'll try and sort of join two questions together to get this in. So one was, how many reviewers are typically asked, and why sometimes are more reviewers asked for some papers than others? And there's also a question about incentivizing reviewers, and if in some way we incentivize these reviewers, say through discounts in publishing, could that somehow impact the quality of the review? So it's slightly different questions, but I'm trying to jam them together in interest of time. So the first one about why does it have more reviewers than others, and second is not just having completely voluntary review processes, could this somehow impact the quality of reviews?
So first about this the first question, how many reviewers? Typically, journals do 2 or 3 reviewers. But the process for you to asking the reviewer, sometimes you ask for multiple reviewers at the same time, and sometimes you end up with more. For GIL, usually, if I have 2 reviewers, I'm happy. Then sometimes if the reviewers have, completely opposite opinions, and I want to get a 3rd reviewer to help me dig to, like, one hates the paper and one loves the paper. So it's usually I slow down the process and go look for a 3rd reviewer and ask for that. Sometimes I do that in the first round, and sometimes, if I say major revisions, then that's the point that I get a 3rd reviewer. But in other journals, I know that some papers that I submitted to Journal of Climate, I got 4 reviewers, and I'm like, wow, how did editor go through getting so many reviewers? But typically it's 2 to 3 reviewers, but you have to ask sometimes many people before you get 2 or 3 that accept, especially post-COVID has been much more difficult to get reviewers, and some papers tend to be hard. I don't know exactly why, but sometimes you have to ask 12, 15 people to get 2 reviewers, yes.
Yeah, and then could anyone perhaps then comment on this idea of incentivizing reviewers through some way, and whether, it's going to be an opinion, but whether in their opinion this may bias the review process.
Publons is trying to do that, yeah. You say they can count how many reviews you do for different journals and from different societies and from different, and then they give you some, kind of saying you are a good reviewer, you are the top reviewer in your field or something like that. The other way we do it, we give awards to reviewers. So I think that's a way that editors have of, thanking the reviewers that they really think they're doing a good job. I don't know about, monetizing. I'm not sure that's a good idea.
Okay, thank you very much. The hour is up now, so thank you very much. I think that was a really great discussion. I think I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone has learned a lot. So sorry, I think there were a couple of questions we didn't get around to answering, so apologies to the people who maybe got there, but I think we got through most of them. So thanks once again. I guess for everyone looking out, we check the newsletter in terms of looking out for other AGU early career seminars and webinars that are coming up. And yeah, and hope to see everyone again. And
Thank you
so much to our top panelists.
Good being with you all. Panelists, take care.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing. Bye.
Bye.